Welcome everybody to this interview, and today I've got Dr. Drew Ramsey with me today. Dr. Drew is a nutritional psychiatrist, and he's written several books on how to use food as medicine to help with mental health and mental well-being. And his latest book is called Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety. So Dr. Ramsey, delighted to have you here today.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here, and I look forward to speaking about food and mental health and anxiety, and thanks for everybody who's tuning in.
So my first question is dark chocolate. We hear dark chocolate is good for you, so how much of it can we eat, and is starting in the morning too soon?
Well, it's a great question. We all love dark chocolate. It's one of the power players in my new book, Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety. And I put it there not just as a marketing tactic. Dark chocolate is really what I consider a brain food. And so when someone is considering a food and whether to include it or not, as a nutritional psychiatrist, as much as I love dark chocolate and wild salmon and cashews, what I'm really curious about are individual specific needs. So for some individuals who have a lot of anxiety, foods that have natural stimulants, whether they're theobromines or natural forms of caffeines, they make them more jittery and more anxious. And so if you like dark chocolate, it's no problem for you. You don't get, a little jumpy or a rapid heart rate. Sure, just starting some dark chocolate in the beginning of the day, especially if it's a very high cacao content, or adding in cacao nibs or eating cacao beans in the morning. It's a great way to start the day, very stimulating, lots of magnesium, iron, fiber, really, really healthy food.
Yeah, absolutely. So just backing up a bit, why did you choose nutritional psychiatry? And it seems to be a new area, but I'm guessing it's a growing area within that field of psychiatry.
Yeah, nutritional psychiatry is new. I'm not so much I chose it as it chose me. My background really revolves around, on a personal level, wanting to eat really healthy, and throughout college and when I was an athlete, and then as a young physician, really wanting to take care of my health. And just seeing as much as I was training in psychiatry, there wasn't an emphasis at all on nutrition, which was really different than my personal life, where I was thinking a lot about what I ate and how it influenced my health. And so really for my whole career, I've been focused on how do we integrate and think about food in the mental health setting, and specifically in the clinical setting. Like, what do we tell patients? What do we ask patients? And then more recently, how do I help other clinicians and help individuals understand the latest science around food and brain health? And that's nutritional psychiatry, really, if you're thinking about any mental health condition, but I focus mostly on depression and anxiety. Not that we want to replace all of the types of treatment, really much more so that I want everyone with a brain to be thinking about how do you feed it? How do you feed your mental health? And specifically, if you're struggling with certain symptoms like depression and anxiety, what aspects of nutrition can be helpful to you?
So before we dive into the very specifics of, what is good to eat for people who do suffer from anxiety, has been said we live in an age of anxiety. It does seem to be an epidemic. What's your opinion on why there are such increasing levels of anxiety, excluding what's happened over the past year with COVID?
Prior to COVID, we were having a real mental health epidemic that was driven by a few things. First was a transition as people were, really all of us, trying to understand the meaning of digital relationships and social networks. Are those good? Are they bad? Do they help us do more with our friends, or do they deteriorate our social relationships and our mental health? That really was up in the air in some ways. There is more anxiety in part because there's just more input. So if you're worried about your finances, you can pick up your phone and pull up an app and quickly, with a scan of your face, check all of your accounts. If you are really wanting to acquire or learn about anything, you can quickly go shopping for it. And so there's just a different set of cognitive challenges for us. there's a disruption in how we socialize and think about human relationships, which makes people, I find in my clinical practice, feel in some ways very anxious because it adds a layer of insecurity.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are some of the things I see contributing to anxiety. Of course, another part is just that our diet has changed, and that does contribute to both anxiety and depression. There's a lot of science, particularly around depression, but as I write about in the book, we really try and give anxiety due diligence, because we know more people suffer from anxiety than suffer from depression, although they're both very debilitating illnesses. But as diet has changed, we've really lost a few key food groups that seem to play a role in anxiety, namely the B vitamins, some nutrients, minerals like magnesium and zinc. Choline is a B-like vitamin that has some relationship to anxiety. And then really change the types of food that feed the microbiome. These are all the bacteria that live in the gut. We used to really have a more plant-forward diet, basically consisted of a lot of plants, no processed foods, and then a lot of seafood or meat. That's really shifted for most people to now eating mostly highly processed foods, getting minimal intake of fiber, and really also missing out on a number of these key nutrients.
Yeah. So I understand from your work that you're more of a proponent of getting people to return to a traditional diet, and that traditional diet might be something akin to a Mediterranean style diet. It would be a diet, let's say, where you have the rainbow of colors of fruit and veg, and you also have the carbohydrates and your proteins, and also the seafood is very important, as you mentioned there, for B vitamins, etc. So is it true that you recommend people make a change to the food that they're eating, and you don't believe in supplements, or do you think there's a role for supplements to play in that as well?
Well, you're right first that my sense about food is mostly helping people move to more whole foods, or sometimes it's called traditional diet. I try to do that as a psychiatrist would, in a very specific and individual way, and to kind of move people from a diet culture of, worshiping silver bullet superfoods and disdaining certain nutrients, to really thinking about the real world of what's in our supermarkets, how we eat, how you as an individual like to eat. In terms of supplements, it's again a very personal question. I'm really against the idea that we use supplements to replace food or to replace nutrition. I don't think that's how the body works, and I just don't think humans understand nutrition or brain health or physiology to the level that sometimes supplement companies would want us to believe that they do. So, simply taking a little more tryptophan that doesn't treat clinical depression, even though tryptophan makes serotonin. My concern with supplements aside, though, certainly when I have patients and they're struggling, let's say they don't eat seafood, or let's say they eat seafood and they've never tried an omega-3 supplement and they don't want to try an antidepressant, I'll try certain supplements. There are a few that have some clinical evidence behind them for both depression and anxiety. It's more that I don't want to try and use medications or supplements in place of helping people with healthy lifestyle. Not that it's easy to eat well or to move our bodies, but when we do that, we tend to have a better quality of overall health and mental health.
So if I was to come into your practice and, told you that I suffered from an anxiety disorder, and also then described what my diet was like, and let's say there was a lot of processed foods in that. But I also said to you that, I struggle with maybe motivation in terms of changing my diet as well. What would be advice that you would give to me in terms of how I could make some small changes, at least to start seeing an improvement in mood by the food that I eat?
Yeah, well, first I'd want to hear about some of your favorite foods and some of the foods you're craving. I'd ask you to kind of walk me through your day. So this just happened. I just saw a new patient, and he's a really brilliant foodie, he's a chef and knows lots about food. But as I walked through his day as an eater, it was all this really complicated stuff, which, as a chef makes sense. He's trying out this and that and new recipes and making all kinds of stocks. But what struck me is there was just nothing really easy. Like if you wake up and you're in a bad mood, a food that, usually cheers you up a little bit, or just as easy, like, like a yogurt or a smoothie or a container of hummus in the fridge. And so, for you, I'd want to look at that dietary history you give me a little, walking me through your day as an eater. And then I'm looking for food categories, where are your leafy greens? What's your relationship with seafood like? And then kind of where your mental health is. So if you're really struggling, I might not start with food other than like, hey, can I be helpful in any suggestions? And if I hear, yeah, I'm really having a hard time with snacks. All right, then I hear an invitation that even if your mental health is in a bad spot, you're okay talking a little bit about food, because sometimes people feel like it's too much. But often what I find is by keeping it simple, like, hey, before I see you next week, why don't you try and eat a seafood meal? Just try one, and I'll make some suggestions. Like I just found really delicious grilled fish tacos on a fresh corn tortilla, even here. I'm in really rural Indiana where there's not a lot of seafood and a lot of processed food. Amazing fish tacos, all just fresh ingredients. So that would be a kind of an example of maybe a challenge. Or if I hear you like leafy greens but you're tired of salads, I get really excited about all the other ways to eat leafy greens, like making kale chips at home or making pesto. My new book, Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety, actually is a formula for all these different types of pestos. And so that's the way that I would approach someone around food, is to really expand joyfulness and expand diversity.
Yeah, makes sense. And for a person coming in, how long should they be on a diet, or how long should they have to wait to see a change in their mood? How many weeks of eating in a better way can they expect to see some progress?
Well, I think initially people feel progress in a sense of sometimes optimism very quickly, in terms of feeling a sense of clarity and empowerment. There's something about taking a step forward and doing the right thing. Like, for example, if you have a bunch of things on your to-do list, you haven't sent your thank you notes, and you do it, you feel a sense of accomplishment. So there's some initial effects that aren't about the nutrients, that are about people feeling empowered. This isn't a complicated psychotherapy or a medication that may or may not work for you. This is you eating foods that you like. Then in terms of the actual antidepressant effect, in my experience prescribing a lot of antidepressants and doing a lot of psychotherapy over the years, those treatments tend to take about a month to 6 weeks to at least have some initial effect. And so the reasoning behind that, at least my understanding, is that if we think about depression and anxiety, in part is relating to inflammation, relating to the microbiome, relating to brain, what's called neuroplasticity, the idea that our brains can be in a kind of growth and repair and resiliency mode. And that a lot of the choices that we make when we have a sedentary lifestyle and we're eating lots of inflammatory foods is we don't really have our brains in grow mode. So I think about food as one of those interventions that's helping coax the brain more into a growth and resiliency mode. And then there's the downstream effects of that, which I think take a couple of months.
Yeah. And is it a case that there are certain people who respond incredibly well to a change in diet, and then other people who see no effect at all? And what would be the percentages of those kind of different groups of people?
Well, I don't think there's anybody that won't feel anything at all. You might not feel a vast change in day to day, but certainly looking at the data, it's very clear that if you have a human brain, you want to be feeding it differently than most people are. That's not really right now. The debate so often around food is like whether you should be a carnivore or a vegan. And it really shows how people are missing the point. The point of food is to feed your brain, period. There's nothing else that's really important to you as an organism. And feeding your brain is really where all of your focus is. You want to bet all, if you think about it, what organ would you want to like double down on and like bet all of your money on? It would be the brain. It's just by far the most interesting, the most complex, and I would argue the most nutritionally sensitive. And so in terms of the percentage of people, for sure, just like I give a patient Zoloft, sometimes you just hit a home run. You radically change that person's life. Other times people don't do so well on Zoloft. And so the same thing is true with food, in the sense that some patients who are really on a lot of processed food, who really have lost control of how they're eating in a certain way and are eating a lot of processed and prepackaged foods, as they reclaim the narrative and story and the nutrient density of real whole foods, I think significantly they see an improvement. It's really surprising to me. Initially, people report improvements in energy and sleep. And in terms of what percentage of people will respond, it's really hard to generalize like that, in the sense that one of the things I like about getting food right is if it doesn't work, we really know that there's need for other interventions. And even when it does work and people have a benefit from food, I'm certainly the first to, I hope everyone hears my message that I really hope people seek treatment, but I'm not really interested in being an anti-medication person, or saying that, people who get depressed aren't getting their food right, or gosh, people who need medications, they just need to eat more blueberries. I don't really think that's helpful to anyone.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I've heard you speak about seafood, and it seems to be, I don't know if superfood is the right word to use for the brain, but you are a big advocate of, the mussels, the oysters, clams, because of the type of fats they contain. Now, you mentioned though as well that some parts of the world it's hard to get access to seafood. So in that case, is it worth supplementing with a fish oil, a good fish oil, for example?
Yeah, I don't think that's actually true about seafood. I think that is one of those myths about eating, that seafood isn't accessible and it's expensive. I am in Indiana, where don't have any coasts or lakes or anything. There's not a seafood history here at all. And in the Walmart supermarket, there's wild salmon, both frozen sides of wild salmon. There are cans of wild salmon. I can get a half pound of canned wild salmon for $3.50. There's anchovies, there's anchovy paste, there's canned mussels, clams, and oysters. And so I certainly appreciate that the knowledge of how to use seafood definitely is something that people have a privilege of knowing, the access to some foods for sure. I mean, I don't want to in any way dismiss that. I just really like encouraging everyone that you can eat really well for your brain. You can do that on a budget. You can do that with simple foods you have access to. Just because I think so often, for me at least, I didn't eat seafood until I was 30, let's say, and I really hated seafood. It was like disgusting to me. And so I think part of what perpetuated that for me was this myth of like, ooh, it's this complicated thing. I'm like going to get food poisoning, or I'm going to get a tapeworm, or, is it flaky or is it done? And so seafood is important, to get to your question, not just because of the fish oil and the omega-3 fats. That's certainly, with wild seafood, one of the most important nutrients in there, but also seafood's going to bring iodine, selenium, a complete protein. Some forms of seafood, like the bivalves, mussels, clams, and oysters, are going to bring an incredible amount of vitamin B12. There's a lot of zinc in the bivalves, very important antidepressant nutrient. So I think seafood is one of those food categories that adding that in a couple of days a week really, really can make a huge difference when it comes to mental health.
So could we say then, if there was one thing people did listening to this, that they made more of an effort with seafood, and what frequency? Is that once a week or 3 times a week? Like, how much is good?
Yeah, so in Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety, I go through a complete 6-week plan where I go through recommendations like this. And my recommendations for, certainly a food category to focus on or to think about is seafood. To think about, if you're not a seafood eater, just start with one meal this week. I think my first thing for everyone listening is just to ask that you really focus and think about feeding your mental health, and just to prioritize that as you think about anxiety, that you focus on times where you're more anxious because you're not as well nourished as you could be, or you're more anxious because maybe you had a little too much to drink last night, or you're more anxious because, this happens to me, I get more anxious when I'm just a little undernourished. I haven't given myself a good lunch. It's 2 p.m. Feeling a little, I wouldn't say I'm hangry, I'm just feeling a little jumpy, a little jittery. But seafood, I would say my other favorite food categories for anxiety for people to look into are the fermented foods, where you're working on feeding the microbiome, and just more rainbow vegetables.
Okay, yeah. So fermented, like sauerkraut, stuff like that, just including that.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Yeah. So I mean, some of the criticism with starting a whole food diet or approach is that people say we just don't have the time, working 2 jobs, kids, and everyone seems to fall back on processed food because of that. What would you say to those people?
I would say I hear you, and that there's a difference between getting takeout that's healthy. There's a difference between, helping your local restaurants stay afloat and supporting them, and I think all that can be done and cook at home and eat at home.
Great. I know we've got to wrap up shortly. Maybe one last question.
Excuse me. Oh, sorry. I just started coughing there. Let me just give you another soundbite on that. Let me just get a water. Hold on.
No problem.
I think for people who are struggling with time, I'm a physician. I run my own business in addition to being really involved in our digital work and being very active on social media. So I appreciate not having a lot of time. I certainly have the privilege probably of being able to afford and pick the food that I want. In terms of time, though, my favorite tips are sheet pan dinners. I'll just chop up a cabbage, maybe some pieces of salmon, broccoli, some other veggies, splash olive oil on everything, slide it in the oven. I find those to be really satisfying and easy meals. I love batch cooks of some staples, things like the dashi broth, really inexpensive, filling seafood-based broth in ramen noodles. And so I'll do a big batch of that or a big batch of pesto. So I think batch cooking can really help in terms of being organized. And then another is mindset for me, of really trying to get into the mindset of enjoying my food in the process and of making it efficiently and feeding my family, and really having gratitude that I have the privilege and the option to do that. Really trying to get in that mindset, because, it can become a grind. I'm not a superhero by any means. I I go through drive-through and get takeout and get milkshakes and burgers. But I really also try and lean towards the food that I know is best for my mental health and for my family's brain health.
Great. So wrapping up then, one last question about psychiatry. And this, I imagine food is going to become an increasingly important area for psychiatry. Where do you see it going in the future? Psychiatry in general, with the advent of technology and maybe even how we are learning about new medications, how they could be even more beneficial, and now food as well becoming a huge important component. What do you see happening in the next 10 to 20 years in psychiatry?
The future of psychiatry is really bright. The way that we diagnose mental health concerns is going to completely be revolutionized over the next 10 years. The way that we think about prevention in mental health and how we integrate lifestyle and genetic information to create customized plan is completely going to revolutionize, go through a revolution. I'm very excited about our increasing knowledge about the microbiome and how processes like inflammation play a role in mental health symptoms. And then because of digital technology, we're going to have more access to clinicians, more access to information, and more access to treatments. And so I just think it's an exciting time for mental health. I do appreciate there's a lot of ground we have to cover, because most people don't have access. There's still a tremendous amount of stigma. Many people are still really in a stage of not thinking or talking about their mental health in an active way, and I appreciate that. I've really I've been blessed in my life to have access to a lot of treatment, to have a lot of psychotherapy personally, and to be able to use that to really help fuel my capacity for work and for deep, meaningful human relationships. And so just in closing, I hope everybody really feels my encouragement. Aside from the amazing future of mental health and brain health, just for your future, that the more you can focus on your own mental health, the care of the self, really understanding and appreciating and having compassion for your challenges, and then really envisioning the type of life and person you want to be. I just believe the more we engage in that, the more love and compassion we bring into the world, the more connections we bring into the world, and the better we all are.
Wonderful. So the book is called Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety, and I'm guessing it's in all bookstores and it's on Amazon. Where else can people go to find more about you and what you do?
Thank you so much. So everyone, I'm Drew Ramsey, MD, and that's where I am on Instagram and also my website, drewramseymd.com. I have a digital e-course for individuals called Eat to Beat Depression, as well as the book, Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety. And then for any coaches or clinicians listening, we have the first ever training for clinicians in nutritional psychiatry that is available. It's a 10-hour course, and we also have a monthly clinician community meeting where we review the latest literature and clinical techniques, and so I'd encourage you to check that out. There's information on all of that on my website. Again, it's drewramseymd.com. And I just want to say thank you for this lovely conversation. I really hope that it helps folks think about anxiety and their mental health, and how some, not overwhelming changes, but some small changes in your diet really can make a huge difference in how you feel.
Dr. Ramsey, thank you very much for your time. It's been a wonderful interview.